Thank you so much. My name is Mikala Narlock, and I am a white female with shoulder-length brown hair from the University of Notre Dame. And today I am co-presenting with Don Brower, who will now introduce himself.
Hi, I am Don Brower, and I'm a white man with brown hair and glasses. And between Mikala and I, we are co-product owners for our institutional repository, which is nearing, if not already at middle age. So can you go to the next slide? All right, so this outline of what we're going to do, we're going to introduce our situation, describe our midlife crisis and what we've done to address it. And we have a conclusion and time for a Q&A. So, okay, our institutional repository is named Curate ND. It seems fitting. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't say that we are at the University of Notre Dame, so this next name even more fitting. Our technology was cutting edge Samvera stuff as of 2013. So we had Fedora 3, we have Solar 4, we have some bunch of gems. The thing is that this is still our tech stack in 2020. Nothing has really changed from this. So we do have some custom pieces. We have an ETD deposit workflow, and we have one for preservation storage, but by and large, nothing's really changed from Samvera 2013. So the timeline, this is a kind of a timeline of Curate ND. The idea was kind of conceptualized probably about 10 years ago, and it finally got traction and development started in 2013. The code was originally based off of Penn State ScholarSphere, and then we quickly changed it to use Sophia once that existed. We launched this self-deposit repository in 2014, and then originally the development was overseen by the development team and IT, but in 2015 a larger team formed, the oversight team of interested people inside the library. In 2016, we appointed the first product owners to prioritize and guide developers, since the oversight team was more like for a communication, but they didn't work on a day-to-day level. So we needed on a day-to-day level to make things useful for users. And then both Mikala and I have been product owners since the beginning of 2019. Okay, so we currently have 2 developers, 2 product owners, and some number of stakeholders, probably at least 10 across the library. And over the life of the service, we've had many more developers, probably around 6 or 7, who have come and gone, and 2 other product owners, and we've had way more even stakeholders, Okay, so let's talk about our midlife crisis. This is one of the first things that we talked about when we started. So this has kind of been an ongoing thing since we started in 2019. So like any system, once the original repository was put into production, it has grown organically and has in places become complex and confusing and are contradictory, not even just to users, but also themselves, so internally. And this is our situation too. So probably one of the biggest problems was that the repository had an overly broad scope at the beginning. So I mean, almost any kind of item or content was allowable. So for example, we were hosting scholarly materials like ETDs, patents, and data sets. We also had more traditional IR content such as journal articles. We had some journal citations. We also had digital collections, including finding aids, and we had a whole bunch of architectural lantern slides. And then because we had the resources and the infrastructure to support support it. We also ended up getting some electronic resources too that were purchased. So really anything that needed to be made available online was kind of just put it in Curate, because as one of the few places that we as had to make it easy access to the content and make it accessible. So in fact, one of the original design goals, which was never actually reached, was to support high energy physics data. So that's like around 60 terabytes per data set. And yeah, never quite got there. So, okay. So what this meant is that the repository handled a lot of things okay, or less than okay, but we never did anything well. And then even some conceptual tasks that seemed like they should be easy to do were really hard to do, like changing a record type or updating permissions. So this is what we led up to our midlife turmoil. So we had, because in addition, so some of these things I talked about were like technical stuff, but we also had other things situational campus-wide. So campus-wide, there was adoption, but it was little, and there was even little awareness of the system. We had like 2 or 3 people who, especially this one person who knew about it and put a lot of things in there, but that's like it. So we also had little outreach. We had an increasing amount of technical debt because we had a system from 2013 that's still trying to behave like it's 2013. We had limited buy-in from our internal stakeholders, like the library faculty. And we also had some organizational upheaval, in part from the Mellon grant that you heard our colleagues speak about on Monday. So we also had a library-wide reorganization happen too, and these things drew developer time and resources from the repository itself. So now I'll hand this over to Mikala.
Yeah, so as Don was saying, with limited adoption and like a system that was really emotionally and technically laborious to maintain, we asked ourselves, okay, how are we gonna move this thing forward? So at the time, we set aside the sunk cost of time and energy, and instead thought carefully about the role we wanted Curate indeed to play in the emerging digital library landscape at Hesburgh Libraries. And we eventually came to the realization that in order for this system to continue, we had to make it useful, and not just useful to us librarians, but useful to our campus community. So to make the system useful, we took kind of a 3-pronged approach, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. So first, we refined the scope. Then we really focused our development effort. And lastly, we did what I've been calling centering the repository. So first, let's talk about refining, because our system is not new and improved. It is old and refined. And that's a joke I make a lot that Don is probably so sick of hearing. Okay, but to refine the scope, we started by critically evaluating Curate ND and examining the strengths of the system like as it stood. So like without any improvements, what about Curate ND works well? And there were a couple of things that really came to the fore of our minds, which were access and permissioning controls. It's a really flexible system at both the record and even the file level, so you can have a lot of customization. Curate also handles persistence really well, so it makes local pearls, but it also can provide DOIs for users. Self-deposit for an average file was a very easy thing to do. And lastly, our system does preservation really well. So it's a homegrown backend that Don can provide more details on. But it's really, really robust, and it's actually proven itself on a few times, so we really trust this preservation backend. So after we thought about what worked well, we then discussed what was needed in our current digital library landscape. So as Don said, there was the in-process Mellon grant that was supporting digital collections, and it was doing it really, really well. And so we knew that we didn't need to worry about that. But what was really missing on campus was a discipline agnostic repository where folks could just put their research and their scholarly outputs. So we decided to refine our scope and kick the digital collections out, for lack of a better word, and really just focus on scholarly materials. And if you remember, we also said there was kind of those miscellaneous files, just put it in Curate. Those are still part of the repository, but they're more just along for the ride. And our focus is really a set of Venn diagram and institutional repository. So as we've kind of already hinted at, but we just want to state very clearly, our guiding principle throughout this whole process was centered around usefulness. We thought that usefulness was just about more important than anything else in the system. And by usefulness, we mean that our job as product owners for the institutional repository is to help our local community do their jobs and do it well. So instead of selling them on a repository on Curate ND, we're showing them how we can help them and how we can help them do their jobs well. And when necessary, this can include referring folks to other systems and repositories. So we often consider very carefully what services we are in the best position to offer, either because they're unique to us, like the ability to make content available only to Notre Dame users, or because they offer such value to the community that folks might be more inclined to use the service. So one example is DOI creation. That is something that folks just lose their mind when they're like, oh my gosh, I can make my own DOI without having to like go through anybody else. Oh, sorry, so sorry, I was trying to scroll. So then in terms of focusing our scope, we didn't just say scholarly materials, we actually focused really particularly on articles and article deposits. Because while these aren't necessarily like flashy or attention getting, they're much easier to like grab onto, both from our side as the product owners, but also for when we do outreach. You know, data sets can be a little squishy when you go talk to people about that, and they can also be really large, which makes it difficult to harvest them. But articles are really tangible, and it makes it really easy to collaborate with librarian colleagues as well, because we can team up and discuss scholarly communication issues and authors' rights. So when we focused on usefulness, we realized very quickly that we would not be able to make the repository comprehensive. And we mean comprehensive in two different ways. So first and foremost, because we have limited staffing, we knew that we would never be able to capture and ingest a ton of new content and be the definitive source of research output on campus. Like there's only 2 of us who work on this, not even full time, like we can't do that. But we also can't be comprehensive in terms of features. So because we were paying down our technical debt and we still have only those 2 developers, we knew we would never be able to develop a system that would support every possible use case. So instead, we focused on like the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the users will only need 20% of the features. And so we focused on that 80% and said, those edge cases or those niche cases, they may come later, but for now, our focus is not there. So to kind of continue on with that, as we focused our development on that 80% of users, we explicitly dropped support for unused services, kind of allowed other services to limp along, and really wanted to improve our existing strengths. So talk about that a little more. We focused on incremental changes. How can we incrementally turn the ship of Curate ND to be where we want to go? First and foremost, with a refined scope, we had a lot of teeth to say no to new features, which was pretty revolutionary for us, at least. We articulated very clear boundaries around the system. And so we no longer had to consider certain requests that were no longer applicable to Curate's new scope. So for example, one frequently requested feature was really customizable collection landing pages, which are great, and they have a very, very valuable purpose for digital collections, but that's not the case for institutional repositories necessarily. So we could kind of push that feature to the side and just focus on what needed to happen to make Curate the best IR it could be. Our developers also targeted low-cost, high-benefit projects. So this included small changes to make the site easier to use or to navigate, but it also included some larger features, like folks often requested that when they deposit things in Curate, it show up in the library catalog. And so while it took us a couple of months to get that feature operational, we knew it was a feature that would help all of our users. And then we also finished some in-progress features that had stalled or just been stopped for various reasons that were, 80% of the way done. Well, let's just kick those into production and keep going. And lastly, we really focused on paying down our technical debt by prioritizing maintenance and gem upgrades. And like, this is kind of difficult to spin in an upbeat kind of way, but we decided it was critical. So we gave ourselves a 3-year time period to pay down our technical debt enough to start looking at what our next steps for the repository might be. Because as we are right now, any migration path is really difficult to comprehend. So we wanted to pay down our technical debt enough that we could start looking at those earnestly. Okay, so by focusing on these minor improvements and those incremental changes to make the system easier to use, we could show users why this is a helpful tool. And then we could increase adoption, and by increasing adoption, show the value of the system to our administration and superiors, and then get more resources to further improve the system. So we were trying to engage in this like positive feedback loop that had to start somewhere. And we started by focusing development efforts as much as we could. Okay, so our last area of effort post midlife crisis was on centering the repository, which I'm kind of loosely defining as like meeting users where they are and finding our champions. And you may have seen Don giggle because he did not like this phrasing. So anyways, by centering the repository, I meant by identifying our supporters and interacting with them directly. So luckily, Don and I started a needs assessment that involved interviewing faculty, staff, and students across campus to see what their needs were and figure out if there were any services that we could easily provide or that we might already be offering that they just don't know about. So during that process, we kind of came to the realization that faculty and graduate students were not our support network, which we can discuss more if you'd like offline, but instead, our allies were kind of in 3 groups of people. And the first was outreach and marketing professionals. Like we have a colleague in the library, Tara O'Leary, who is like our go-to human. Administrative professionals. So those people that are keeping the labs running, who are keeping departments and centers and institutes kind of together. And then internal library advocates, which was primarily new hires who only knew Curate ND as an IR. So we decided that it was absolutely critical to meet our champions where they are. And as I mentioned in that needs assessment, we found our support network, but our champions were actually centers and labs on campus because they have some really interesting needs. So one example of this is an institute where faculty might use the services of the center, but the faculty are actually distributed across campus. So how does this center then show its impact if faculty are in physics or bioengineering or wherever, and there's no unified way to show like, oh, all of these publications relate back to this center. And so we built a collaborative workflow and made some really modest improvements to the system that made their lives easier, where we helped them upload their content. We exposed the records via an OAI PMH endpoint that we had already built. And then campus IT helped them harvest the records and put it in a newsfeed on their website. And it was pretty painless, but it was like, they were ecstatic to see it. Okay, so all of this leads up to the, so what do you do when your repository enters middle age? And the first thing is make sure you have strong internal advocates. So this can be product owners like Don or I. It could be our developers. Like I know our developers really believe in Curate ND and want to see it succeed. But it also needs to be folks at the administrative level. So like we are lucky to have some support for revitalizing and maintaining this system, but without them, I'm not sure that would have been possible. Number 2, instead of focusing on necessarily like a midlife crisis or a midlife turmoil, we like to reframe it as a midlife rebirth or an opportunity. So even though the tech was really difficult to maintain, well, actually it is really difficult to maintain, and we still have some limited adoption and limited awareness, it doesn't mean that the tool wasn't useful or like isn't actually needed by campus partners. It could just be that it needs a reframing and kind of like a rebranding to reintroduce it to the campus community. Third, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, use is more important than sunk cost. As was said in the presentation on Monday about design thinking, sometimes you have to throw away the trash. So just because you have sunk cost in something doesn't mean it needs to continue. But if something is useful, it probably needs to continue. And we were lucky that Curate fell into that latter category, because I think we would have had a different conversation if it weren't useful. And lastly, Donna and I joke that we inadvertently discovered Marketing 101 and learned the concepts that a lot of freshman marketing majors like already knew about. First is like know your audience and know your champions. It made it really easy to not only do outreach, but also to develop for them. And we weren't just spread so thin we couldn't meet anybody's needs. And second, one thing that we did some research into marketing, and we found out about something called product concept, which is that you don't sell to your audience. You show them how you can help them and meet their needs. And that's been really important for us as we do our outreach to campus members. So before we take questions, I wanted to take a second to thank everybody at Notre Dame. And really, I mean, there's probably many of you in this call who have helped curate ND in various ways. So we just want to thank you for your contributions to the system and our successes. There are way too many people to name because we would inadvertently forget somebody. But I mean, hundreds of thousands of hours have gone into this system, and we're just so, so grateful for everybody's contributions. So thank you if you are one of these people. So now we have time for questions. And if you don't feel like asking a question now, you are welcome to email us, or I put my Twitter handle there. You're welcome to tweet at us.
Thank you so much. There's some really great feedback in Slack about your focus on users and champions, and really your whole approach there. There's a lot of appreciation for that. So we do have a question in the chat here. What was your strategy for finding and engaging your repository champions, and did you know them already?
That's a great question. Don, I'm going to start off, and then if you would like to jump in afterwards, go ahead. So in terms of repository champions, I actually have to thank that human I mentioned earlier, Tara O'Leary at Notre Dame, because she had been kind of like making connections throughout the campus without us knowing about it for a very long time. So when Curate was ready to start engaging champions, she had a whole list of people for us to talk to. And those were primarily folks in, it's called Notre Dame Research, which is just like the collection of, labs and institutes on campus. And so that was where we started. And then it was just kind of word of mouth. And I'll admit that there were quite a few people we talked to who kind of brushed us off, which is totally fine. It's expected. But it was through the word of mouth and the random connections that we just found people who Curate resonated with. Don, you want to?
Yeah, I would say that sometimes like Tara definitely helped me make connections for us. And we also had some people just find us randomly because they have a problem. And then usually we try to talk to people, and especially like these Notre Dame research people, as we're talking with them. This is like one of the main people, it's like a microscope lab. We realized that not only did the Center Institute have people and staffing to put content into here for us, or for them too, but also that there were other such like facilities, they call them facilities on campus, that would probably have similar needs. And then we started going around to all these similar places, and they all had like similar problems. So I think more than anything, it was just kind of paying attention to like, in some ways they kind of found us. So and then we just noticed that it was happening, and we used it to seek out more similar people. So yeah.
I have a question. Can you speak a little bit more to your process of kicking content out, and what happened to that content? How did you kind of navigate that, both maybe technically and also politically, and just a little bit more on that? Thanks.
Yeah, we did it. It's a gradual process. we first started saying that it still is that Curate. We said it's for IR content, but well, actually what we said is that we would focus our efforts on supporting IR content. So other stuff, we still allow other stuff to go in, because we're not necessarily moving it out yet. When that comes, that's fine. But for the moment, like, we consider like it's in there. It has an identifier. People can find it. It is meeting someone's needs. So we're fine with having it in there. But we're kind of setting the stage that we're not necessarily going, if you want, or if this doesn't quite meet your needs exactly, we're not going to spend the effort trying to make it better. Like, we all want to spend our effort focusing on the IR stuff. So that's kind of been the process. And for the most part, people have been pretty receptive, especially when we point out alternatives that they can use. So whenever like the Marvel project goes into production, that will probably immediately receive a lot of stuff right there. So, Kayla.
I don't think I have much to add other than, like, in terms of politically, we tried to do it, as Don's saying, very slowly, and just start by getting folks to recognize that Curate is not the proper home, even if we do put things in there. And then as we upload, we often say things like, but when Marble's ready, or when we can, we look forward to moving this to a more appropriate platform, so that even if we are uploading, we're preparing them for that eventuality.
Yeah, actually, let me just add, like, I think we have already kicked out all the finding aids. They've all moved to archive space, I think.
Thank you.